Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series, a new series on the topic of relationships matter. And today I am extremely excited and delighted to be joined by Benjamin Perks, who is with UNICEF. Hi, Benjamin, how are you?
Great, thank you. How are you?
I'm super. Very, as I say, excited and delighted and a little bit nervous. So Benjamin, we're going to talk about why relationships matter, but maybe you can first of all just tell me a bit about yourself, your background and your pathway into the exciting work you do with UNICEF, please.
Okay, so I'm the head of campaigns and advocacy here in New York at our global headquarters. We have a presence of one sort or another in almost every country on the planet, in low and middle income countries. So most of the world's countries, we have a diplomatic presence that does UN human rights diplomacy as it relates to the rights of children. And my role is I lead a really talented team, and we work on advocacy with governments, with international organizations for better outcomes for children in a number of key areas. Humanitarian, including addressing the worst violations of humanitarian law in conflict zones, education and the right of every child to learn and to have equal and quality outcomes, vaccines, which are very important at the moment. UNICEF is one of the leaders within the group with WHO on COVAX, which is trying to get the world vaccinated against the COVID virus. But we have been working on eradication of childhood diseases with all relevant vaccines for decades, and there's a lot of important work still to be done. Also on climate and water scarcity, which really affect children. But the issue that the final area that I'm working on, which is the one that I think really connects with what you're doing, is the whole issue of child and adolescent mental health and the prevention. We want to bring an end to abuse and neglect of children globally, what we call sometimes adverse childhood experiences. And that is a very real ambition for the UN. It is something that is set out in a sustainable development goal with realistic targets, and we really believe we can do that. So that's what I primarily work on. As you know, I'm also a senior fellow at the University of Birmingham. I'm also do a lot of kind of public speaking and talking about adverse childhood experiences, and also the rights of young people in care, from care, which is special relevance to me because of my own background and journey. So that's, in a nutshell, that's my background and where I am.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I rewatched your super powerful 2015 TED Talk on how do we stop childhood adversity from becoming a life sentence last week as I was preparing for this. And I also read some of your blogs, which cover a range of topics relevant to this podcast. Can you tell me, when did you first become aware of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and what impact did the findings have on you?
I was the head of our mission in Montenegro, which is a beautiful country I love very much. And we were doing a lot of work on education sector reform and deinstitutionalization. And I was reading a book by Paul Tough called How Children Succeed, which was a New York Times bestseller. And it brought together all the science on things like non-cognitive skills, child development, including adverse childhood experiences, in a very accessible way. And it kind of transformed the way that I thought about the work, but also the way that our office did our programming and our advocacy with governments. We put adverse childhood experiences more at the center. And I think the thing that struck us was the prevalence at first. Up until recently, we thought about abuse and neglect as being really marginal things. But then with the adverse childhood experiences, we realized that more than half of any given population around the world have at least one AIDS, from what we can see, often much more than half, up to 80% in some contexts. And that between a quarter and a third of people have three or more, and that those people are much likely to have worse life outcomes across almost every single wellbeing indicator. So this fundamentally changed the way we work. And then what we really noticed was when we went out and spoke to people about this in a way that was non-judgmental and kind of inclusive and sensitive, they immediately engaged with it. They understood it. We spoke in the Parliament. We spoke to the Prime Minister and the President. We took it along with the other reforms and other issues to policymakers, and they embraced it, and it made sense to them. So when we frame it right, I think that adverse childhood experiences is one of the real game changers of our time in terms of change, addressing policy and moving policy, revolutionary kind of policy change to improve outcomes for children.
Okay, and when you mentioned at the beginning some of the strands of work of UNICEF with the humanitarian dimension, of course, many children grow up in areas where there's conflict, there's violence, there's warfare, or there might be famine and people don't have enough to eat, or then much of the world is also dealing with the harms of racism. So when you add in those adversities and traumas too, the stress burden that some children are living with is greater again, in addition to the original 10 ACEs. Isn't that correct, Benjamin?
Yeah, I think so. I think ACEs is one framework. To me, there are 3 or 4 catastrophic burdens that happen in childhood that drive life-lasting negative outcomes, potentially at a population level. The first one is child poverty, and that can be child poverty in the UK that we call relative poverty, or child poverty in a famine-affected area where it's absolute poverty and there's not enough to eat. The second catastrophic burden is discrimination and exclusion, and that can be because of race here in the United States. It can be because somebody's from a Roma background in Eastern Europe, or an indigenous background in Australia, or because they're a girl in Afghanistan, or person with disability anywhere in the world. Discrimination and exclusion also set children up for unequal outcomes through the life cycle. The third one is humanitarian, particularly war and famine. These have devastating impacts in childhood that are going to have a cost that goes on through the life cycle. And the fourth one, of course, is adverse childhood experiences. And I think what's important is not to put these 4 things in competition with each other, to remember that sometimes one of them will happen in isolation with a person or with a group. Sometimes they're mutually reinforcing. We need to address all of them if we are really dedicated to the rights of children.
Yeah, and I was reading as well your interesting interview with Lisa Cherry in her recently published book, Conversations That Make a Difference for Children and Young People. And in that you refer to emotional poverty as being as damaging really as financial poverty and social exclusion in terms of generating poor outcomes over the life course. What do you mean by emotional poverty, Benjamin?
I think the world has not landed on an agreed set of ways of describing these things, but I think it's what Ruth Perry would call relational poverty. Okay. It's what we might call adverse childhood experiences, but in a global context, it's not immediately recognizable what that means. So emotional poverty is when somebody is deprived of love. I think Stephen Porges said that trauma is the disruption of connection. Children are biologically programmed to move towards a parent or two from the moment they're born, in fact, before they're born. And if that connection is not there, that has a huge biological impact because it's a biological imperative. That connection is needed for learning, for protection, and for love and attachment. If it is not there, children interpret it as a threat and a risk. Even the babies interpret it as a threat and a risk. It activates the stress response system, and it has a huge impact on their development. So what we're trying to do, in addition to addressing child poverty through things like reform of social protection systems or programs that address hunger, we're also looking at how can we end emotional poverty by preventing the intergenerational transmission of emotional poverty, by having parenting programs where parents can learn about child development, learn of the risks of some of the things that we've all been doing for a long time that we now know don't help kids, but also become self-aware of how their own history can affect the present in a non-judgmental, supportive way that is not targeting specific people, but is at a population level that every parent will get it. And then also the second intervention to end emotional poverty is to make sure every child in school is connected. I think that I'm probably repeating a little bit what some of your other interviewees have said, but the idea that every child in every school should be safe, seen, soothed, and secure, that they should be brought to understand that they matter as an individual, they're in somebody's mind and in somebody's heart, and we care that they do well as a society. If we can do parenting and connected schools, we believe that we can have much better outcomes for children at a global level, because these are low-cost, evidence-based interventions that would be replicable in the same way previous generations replicated vaccines everywhere.
Yeah, I agree with you that the schools have such a role to play in all this, and many children the world over, my kids included, have felt the loss of school during lockdown, and the social dimension and learning how to manage conflict and everything. But a lot of our teachers, I think, feel quite stressed, and the idea maybe of playing more of a role in holding children who might be traumatized or chronically unsafe might feel quite frightening, because they feel maybe they don't have the skills. Do you think we need to invest massively in training about things like attachment and interpersonal neurobiology and the importance of relational health for human flourishing? Because I'm thinking as well of a really interesting TED talk I saw, Gordon Neufeld, where he says learning follows attachment, and that, Bruce Perry sequences regulate, relate, reason, but these are not typically, to my knowledge, part of the core curriculum for teachers. Do you reckon they need to be, Benjamin?
Yeah. I think we've got education a bit wrong, or our wisdom about education is not keeping up with the science. There is a Professor John Hattie in the University of Melbourne looks at education outcomes globally for the last 50 years as the biggest meta-analysis of what drives education outcomes. We often talk about, and then he creates a league table. And we often talk about the things that are at the bottom of his league table. We talk about classroom size, and, other stuff, things you can see. Yeah. And this is what parents base their decisions on when they go to see a school for their kids, choosing a school for their kids. But you ask them what they remember from school themselves, it's their relationship with the teacher. And no surprise, in John Hattie's list of what has the biggest impact on learning outcomes, it's relationships with teachers. There's also teacher competence and other stuff, but the relationship with the teacher is a key driver of outcome. So I think we need to focus on it, but we also need to recognize that by focusing on it, we save time. The children, somebody said recently, children who are loved come to school to learn, and children who are not loved come to school to be loved. If we can make children who come to school to be loved feel like they matter and they belong, they will learn, and that's a good investment of time. I think what we have to do is work out what in teacher practice is the simple accelerator intervention that a teacher can do to make people in a classroom feel connected. Then the second thing that they need to do is they need to make sure that kids are connected with each other. When we look at the worst mental health outcomes, the most dangerous mental health outcomes, what we often see is children who had no love at home and who are isolated in school. If we can create a community in school, and not just about the teacher relationship, but with the broader community of kids, and promote that belonging, we can prevent those outcomes, and that's better for everybody. So I think it is a challenge to reform education systems. It's always a challenge to reform education systems, but I think it's a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, no doubt. And is there perhaps another challenge in terms of, like, I know lots of people now who are quite comfortable talking about the importance of love. I've even heard a government minister at the time saying that the youth justice system needed to be more loving in Ireland. But this type of talk is kind of unusual, really, especially for politicians or policymakers who are males. But do teachers maybe need to realize, and social workers as well, and foster parents, that it's okay to be loving? In fact, not only is it okay, but we all need it. We all need to feel seen and safe and soothed upon occasion. And that can be what will help a child to get into their cortex, into their thinking brain, in a way that just focusing on maths and reading is not going to reach them, because they don't feel safe, or their attachment needing, perhaps.
We've been following a lot in the UK, in England. There's been a care review at the moment. The big outcome that I think everybody will agree with is that children care are not loved, and that leads to a lot of the things that go wrong later on. And so we need to address that. And I think there's a couple of I think yes, but there's a couple of challenges, right?
Okay.
First, to paraphrase the American author, what do we talk about when we talk about love? You know, every politician drives home from Westminster or in Dublin, from the Parliament in Dublin. I've just forgotten the name of it, but they drive home in the evening listening to songs on the radio about love.
Yeah.
Theatre, and they watch plays about love. They watch movies about love. If they forget St. Valentine's Day, they're in big trouble, and they want their kids to know that their kids are loved, right? So what they then do, what happens then is they go into the Parliament or into the ministry or into the local government, and they completely forget about all of that, and they switch on to this kind of hyper-rational thing. That we always think we need to provide services, and you know, it's irrational, serious, and I think there is a gender dimension to it as well. I guess I think that we need to find a definition that everybody feels comfortable with, and then because I mean, you think it's difficult in Ireland or the UK. I have to go and work I work with governments of all kinds around the world, and many of them in countries where there's never been a conversation about mental health or family violence. Right, so it's a completely different part of the process. So I think that when we talk about connection and belonging, I think those things are really important. That's really easy for people to understand. I think we're making progress on the importance of relationships, getting government to understand the importance of relationships and putting that at the heart of work, at the heart of services. Increasingly, that's gaining traction, and I think we need to define love. I have David Brooks, who's the New York Times columnist. Talks about this a lot. He's written a book about it called The Social Animal. He makes fun of politicians for being so connected in their campaigning and so disconnected in their policy making, which is very interesting. He does a TED talk as well. But he came up with, I think, a definition of love that really, to me, is something that makes a lot of sense. Love is when somebody is a protector, defender, and promoter of another person's inner world. You know,
nice.
Yeah, that idea, and it's linked up a lot with what Bessel van der Kolk is talking about, which is this idea of being in somebody's mind. You know, yes. The most devastating thing, I think, for me when I look back about being from a care background, and spending a large part of my life believing that I was not in anybody's mind. And I think for young people who are in, many more people than we used to think before, who are in emotional poverty at home, in children's homes, in families where they don't feel that they're cared for, they don't feel like they're in anybody's mind. And so that's what we have to create, the kind of societies where it's unacceptable to have any child, a young person, that's not in somebody's mind. And we think sounds crazy, but a lot of traditional societies that have been less touched by Western individualism still practice that. They still have adverse childhood experiences. They still have massive problems. They still have intergenerational transmission, but they have other people in the village or the community that will pick up those connections and make that child feel they belonged. Even in Afghanistan, I came from a background of poverty in the UK and children's homes. I worked in Afghanistan as a young man. And on some levels, I was convinced that the people in Afghanistan, in the midst of a conflict situation, had some level of happiness that I found that was missing in and around the places that I'd grown up in the children's.
Right.
So that we have to learn from other parts of the world on these things.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. I mean, through all the kind of trainings I've done on trauma over the last while, it does seem that many Indigenous practices are a lot more conducive to health than our individualized just the isolated individual responsible for all their outcomes, both positive and negative, in the West. And we don't, as Westerners, always see the value in the village. Cormac Russell, who you may be aware of, wrote a book called Rekindling Democracy. And then Andy Brearley, who I interviewed just recently for this podcast, in his lovely book, Connecting with Young People in Trouble. They both refer to the role of the community, that village idea, about it being so important in rearing safe and healthy, functional children, and indeed keeping adults, well, too, because we must care for the carers too. Do you agree, and I think you do from what you've said already, that we do all, each of us, have a role to play in terms of improving outcomes for children, Benjamin?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and the benefits are there to be seen for everybody. When we're working on the COVID response and trying to get the COVAX out to the vaccine out all over the world, we're making the point, and a colleague said this on Newsnight, that no one is safe until everybody is safe. It's the same with adverse childhood experiences. Like a lot of the challenges in society of crime and high cost public expenditures are the outcome of our failure to care earlier on as a society. It's we have to rethink, what do we tolerate, what's acceptable to us, and what can we give, and how do we get our rewards? We all benefit from kindness and connectivity. We all gain from that. We all get out what we put in. So I think this idea of rebuilding and rethinking connection in society, and rethinking the way we support kids as a community, as a village, as a society, is really important. I was part of a really interesting process in Central and Eastern Europe on deinstitutionalization. And we worked with the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights in the UN and the EU and some other sister UN agencies. And we set a target: no more kids under 3 in institutional care. And what we saw was that governments and societies started almost competing with each other to reach the target. It was mobilizing the sense across a community that we need to, this is what we will be judged by. We need to be better than this. And I think we need that now as we become aware of adverse childhood experiences as a community practice. We want to be judged and to be held up to the highest standards of like community self-esteem by the way we treat our children. And we know we can do better for them, and we know that will enrich our economic, our social, and our democratic development.
Do you think there's a space there as well, perhaps, for raising public awareness around adverse childhood experiences and the importance of relationships for building resilience? Because you mentioned there in Montenegro that you held some events, and you write about them in your blog as well. Is that important? And if so, why is it important, Benjamin?
Well, I think that the thing is that people already know.
Right.
We watched the Oscars last year. I wrote a blog about this. You might have seen it. We watched the Oscars last year, and we noticed that a third of the stories, Elton John and Rocket Man, a third of the winning stories had childhood adversity, and then a positive relationship, and then recovery and healing. And that's one of the most inspiring narratives that we have in our modern world. So it means that people identify with it. People want this. They find this important. They connect with it. And whenever I've gone out and spoken about these things, I've always had a queue of people afterwards lining up to say, to tell me about their uncle or their neighbor or the person, the auntie that couldn't express herself, and now they understand that these people were affected by different types of trauma. It made sense to their lived experience, and Danny Finkelstein made a great point about in climate, which is very relevant to adverse childhood experiences. The more we evolve as societies, the more we solve the basic problems of survival and hunger and all of that, we can address a deeper level of problems related to our consciousness. And this is one of those things that it's a sign of progress as societies, that we're beginning to think about and talk about adverse childhood experiences. It's on people's minds, it's in our cultural narratives, it's going to be in our public policy narratives very soon as well.
And we spoke about the role of teachers do you think other professionals as well, such as social workers, police, psychiatrists, really anyone who's dealing with people who maybe are in distress, needs to understand again about safety and reciprocal relationships, attachment, and even how we can be repeating unhelpful or harmful relational dynamics unknowingly if we don't actually understand these things. Is there a need for wide-scale training, Benjamin, on?
Yeah, well, wide-scale training, you know, how complex is it? It's like everybody used to smoke. If you watch Mad Men, everybody's smoking, right? Here in New York, everybody's smoking. Now, you know, nobody would smoke anywhere near an office. You can't even smoke at the entrance to an office building in Manhattan. And people learn the dangers and they change behavior. I think it's the same, just making sure that people are feeling safe and connected and secure, making sure we don't trigger. Some of these things can become basic, decent, modern behavior in a workplace, in a community. It could just, you know, I mean, training, of course, we need to have training, but a lot of it is stuff that I think at some point in the future will just become common sense. You know, it's the same with parenting, right? It's the same with parenting. Everybody says, oh, you know, you've got all these complex theories about parenting. Child development and children's brains are really complex, but our understanding of parenting now is very, very simple, demanding, supportive, connected. This is very, very simple, and anybody with any level of education can be an amazing parent. And I think it's the same that anybody can be an amazing neighbor, an amazing older member of the community, an amazing police person or a fire person that does the kind of work with the community that prevents the danger and risk before it happens. I hope that these things become common sense.
I hope so too, because you're right. There is, like, from any events that I've organized or spoken at, there is a kind of penny dropping for people when they get the actual science of the ACEs or the correlations and, you know, the dose response and all of that. But in many ways, it's not rocket science. You know, people understand that if all these harmful things happen and you're then unsupported and alone, that's not going to be good for anyone, really. So as you say, hopefully it will become common sense. But just one final question, Benjamin, on public policy. What do you think we need to do to encourage governments, I guess, the world over, about the importance of eradicating, or at least really, really striving to eradicate inequity, and then also to kind of create the conditions for relational health and wealth?
Well, I can tell you about eradicating adverse childhood experiences. I'm not sure about equity. That's a different conversation, and we can have that another time. I think that we need 4 interventions. I know things should normally be in groups of 3, but we need 4. We need investment. We need commitment to invest, to front load the investment, to recognize that at a very optimistic assessment, 8% of global GDP goes on the long-term costs of adverse childhood experiences. We can front load that cost, spend it on primary prevention and response. So investment is number 1. Number 2 is change the conversation. And I mean that in 3 ways. And it's a conversation not just about ACEs, but about mental health. So what we need to do is destigmatize, promote awareness of the basics of the science and the brain development, but also really important, get people to recognize that there are solutions. And even like we work in a continent like Africa, where there's only 2 mental health professionals per 100,000 population, most healing will come through connection. We get people to understand that the better connected they are, although that's very difficult for people affected by trauma, the more connected they are, the better they will be. So that's that's changing the conversation. Investment, change the conversation. The third one is universal access to parenting. I wrote a piece recently with a colleague from Oxford in Nature Journal that calling on people to have a parenting vaccine, policymakers, a parenting vaccine. Every child in the world to be living in a household with parents that have had basic minimum package of learning, self-awareness, solution, problem solving, kind of training to be great parents. And the fourth one is to make sure in every school, in every community, everywhere in the world, that children are connected, they have a sense of belonging, and that they are made to understand they matter as an individual and that they are safe. These four interventions, investment, change the conversation, universal access to parenting support, and connected schools, would have a huge impact and transformation on global ACEs. And often when I talk about this, people say, this is completely crazy. But they said exactly the same thing before the child survival revolution in 1982, when in the space of just 10 years, vaccines against the major 5 childhood diseases dramatically reduced child deaths. They went up from the vaccine coverage went up from 20% of the world's children to 90% of the world's children. And today, 25 million children every year live who wouldn't have lived because of the optimism, idealism, and craziness of those people. So we need a bit more of that on adverse childhood experiences. And if we do that, we can change the world.
Yeah, I agree. I love the fact that, you can distill it down and clearly, your global work with all these different countries, that's very needed to simplify what seems at times like an overwhelming task. But I do think, as you say, if we get the money and then reach all the parents, because again, sometimes like people who come at the world from a particular way of looking at it, an ideological viewpoint might say, no, it's all financial poverty, or it's all X, it's all misogyny, let's say. Whereas really, it's a complexity. Adverse childhood experiences are intergenerationally transmitted. Often they cluster where there is poverty oftentimes, but they don't just occur there. They can happen in any type of household, any religion, any education level. Do you sometimes, just on this one, because sometimes I've come up against people who are very successful, who've had high levels of adversity themselves, and they don't like the ACEs framework for whatever reason. Do you get much kind of pushback yourself when you're around a place raising awareness of the science?
There's two things I want to answer from what you just said. On that one, I think for us at this stage in the United Nations, ACEs are an epidemiological tool to understand prevalence and impacts and costs at a population level. They're not deterministic of an individual's future. That's really important. That's where we are at the moment. Within UNICEF, WHO, that's the
I understand,
two that work on that. That's where we are at the moment. So when we speak about it like that, we don't get pushback. I do see a debate sometimes when people do push back. I ask them, please don't push back on ACEs, because they are something that can have such a positive impact on the population level. If people are misusing ACEs for the wrong reasons, please push back on that, but not the concept of ACEs, because they are something that can help us to understand it. Maybe over the coming years, the language changes. Maybe the methodology will improve. But at the moment, it's helping us to get real traction. It's creating a language that people can understand and recognize. And probably already today, millions of people are having better outcomes because we are more ACE aware than we used to be. The second thing that you said at the beginning of the question was about people talk about poverty or gender or race. I'm only talking about adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, dysfunctional parenting today. Equally important is child poverty. Equally important is gender discrimination. Equally important is racism and exclusion. We can have other conversations about them. Nobody's going to a conversation about child poverty and saying it's all about ACEs. People do that with ACEs because it's the new thing that we're understanding. But they shouldn't. It's not helpful. Right. Recognize they are separate conversations that sometimes converge and sometimes don't. And what's really important in this is sensitivity. If somebody's talking about ACEs and it's all about poverty, I don't know if the people down the road live in a very wealthy house are a victim of incest or not. I don't know if they are emotionally brutalized by their parents. What I need to do is be ready to recognize that anybody any parliaments where I speak, anywhere in the world where we see a population, anybody can be affected by trauma. They need an empathetic witness. They don't need us to show up and say, you don't know what suffering is because you haven't grown up in poverty. And I'm saying that as somebody that comes from real poverty, from a care background myself. I think we need compassion, empathy, calm, and nowhere in a conversation about ACEs should there be any anger or because that's not trauma informed. You have to have a calm environment to talk about the issue, regardless to what we've all been through. We need to have the maturity to be able to have a calm conversation about this and to recognize we're all on a journey on learning, growing. Science is evolving. It's brilliant. It's a great opportunity for all of us. Let's go on this journey together and make the world a better place.
I'm with you, Benjamin. Beautifully summed up there. I'm totally in your corner. And thank you so much for the wonderful work that you are doing and your team there in UNICEF, and for taking the time to speak to me today. I really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It's an absolute pleasure.
So this was Law and Justice with me, Jane Mulcahy, and my guest today was Benjamin Perks from UNICEF. Thanks so much.